I'm coming at you live from Pennsylvania on a beautiful May day, thank goodness. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Evolution of Consumer Food Preferences and Beef's Nutrient Profile and Versatility, presented by Dr. Jennifer Leheska. My name is Beth Stark, and I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist and the Director of Nutrition Outreach and Channel Marketing with Northeast Beef Promotion Initiative, a small but mighty team housed within the Pennsylvania Beef Council that works on behalf of beef farmers and ranchers to develop and execute programming throughout the beef checkoff in the heavily populated Northeast region of the country. This webinar is also being co-sponsored by the Protein Pact, which was spearheaded by the Meat Institute and unites organizations across animal agriculture who are committed to sustain production of nutrient-dense animal source foods for generations to come. For example, the Meat Institute has established the first ever data collection and reporting effort for meat companies, which tracks progress towards ambitious goals such as setting science-based targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You can learn more about the Protein Pact partners and their commitments at theproteinpact.org or at the Protein Pact on major social media platforms. In addition to today's webinar, NEBPI is hosting one more event in August to wrap up our series this year that launched in February. Watch for information on this August webinar, including a link to register in the post-webinar communications you'll receive later today or early tomorrow. And now for a quick housekeeping items before I pass this over to our presenter. Today's webinar is being hosted via Zoom webinar where your camera and microphone are disabled for an optimized viewing experience. Live chat will be enabled for this webinar for interactivity, but we ask that questions be submitted using the Q&A box that appears in the bottom of your Zoom window. And we will hold the Q&A portion of today's webinar until the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and again, you will be receiving that recording. As noted, the follow-up email communication will be sent later today or early tomorrow, and will include the following: a link to the recording, a post-webinar survey link, a CEU certificate for approval of 1 credit by the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and the registration link for the webinar coming up on August 14th. And now let's kick it over to our main event. I am just so excited to introduce today's fabulous presenter, which has just such a unique background as a dietitian. So I'm just really excited for her to take the reins in just a moment. Dr. Jennifer Leheska is a registered dietitian and trained meat scientist who's based in Canyon, Texas. With her profound understanding of the meat and livestock industry, Dr. Leheska enlightens her clients and consumers on the realities of food and nutrition. Dr. Leheska is not only a practitioner, but is also engaged in research and consulting, particularly for beef and cattle related organizations that focus on the significance of meat and a healthy diet. She currently offers comprehensive nutrition counseling and corporate wellness programs through her group practice. She holds degrees from Ohio State University, South Dakota State University, and Texas Tech University, and is a member of esteemed associations like the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and the American Meat Science Association, among others. When Dr. Leheska isn't immersed in her work, she savors time with her husband, Mike, and their 2 teens, Killian and Bridget. Whether they're cheering on the kids at a golf or basketball tournament, getting their hands dirty with ranch projects, or embarking on outdoor adventures, they're a family on the move, making memories and cherishing every moment together. Sounds just so wonderful. So welcome, Dr. Leheska, and please take it away.
Thank you very much, Beth. It's great to be here. I'm just going to switch over and share my slides. And while I do that, I would love to hear where everybody is tuning in from today. So please feel free to share that in the chat, and we will go from there. Does everybody see my slides?
Slides are there. Maybe just go to that presenter view. We do see just some of
There
your
we
notes.
go. All right.
There we go. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, great. So looks like we have people coming in from all over: Columbus, Ohio, go Bucks, Delaware and Kentucky, Florida. Would love to be there right now. Kansas, great to see you all. Thank you all for joining. It is just a pleasure to be here and be able to share this exciting information with you today and some of the amazing facts about beef, along with the people who are responsible for producing it. Also, I want to take this opportunity to share with you one of my favorite things I get to do in my practice every day, and that is give my clients and others permission to eat meat, and specifically beef. You probably don't hear many dietitians giving this type of permission, as it may be considered taboo. So, drawing from both practical experience in animal production and comprehensive research, I am excited to share some of the confidence that I have gained, enabling me to pass on this insight to you today. There we go. All right, just a few housekeeping. Of course, here's my disclosures before we get started. As a PhD and a meat scientist and a practicing registered dietitian, I do share my expertise through a variety of different consulting work. And here are some specific examples in the beef checkoff that I do in such as these webinars today. So the learning objectives that we hope to achieve today is first to understand how beef producers heard the call of consumer preferences and health recommendations and have worked diligently over the years in order to meet the needs of consumers. Also, we're going to explore some new cuts that make our lives easier, from proportion size to affordability. And finally, my hope is that you will feel more confident in how beef can be part of a healthy diet and be willing to share this permission with your clients as well. So you might be wondering, who is this person and why does she seem just a little so passionate about meat? And so I thought I'd tell you just a little bit more about my background. It all started for me on a small hog and grain farm in Northwest Ohio. I loved working with animals, which really sparked my passion for agriculture. And as I grew, so did that desire to get to educate people and talk to people about meat and their food. And that led me to the opportunity to earn the role as the 1995 Ohio Pork Industry Queen. That might be a funny name to hear or a role to be heard about, but this was an important role and I didn't want the crown. I just wanted to get the chance to educate people about farming. And boy, did I have my eyes open that year. For just a small farm girl, getting to go to the bigger city areas and work with consumers for the first time, I learned so much about all the misunderstandings of people and their food and their fears. And so that really stuck with me as I continued my education and helped then guide me to where I am today. So shortly after that, I was introduced to meat science as an undergrad at Ohio State. And I was completely fascinated with the subject. And so I went on to get my master's at South Dakota State University, where I got to dive deeper into this science. And at SDSU, my research experience was really targeted on improving meat quality. So more specifically to how we could improve tenderness, juiciness, and flavor and the consistency of that in our meat product. And so my thesis focused on how to reduce muscle glycogen at harvest, specifically in pork product, in order to improve those muscle quality factors. And so after my master's, though, I knew I really wanted to have the right education in order to talk to people more about nutrition and teach them how meat could be part of a healthy diet for them. So that led me on to Texas Tech, where I had the opportunity to engage in a variety of different research studies from quality, safety, shelf life, and nutrition of meat. And this was in the early 2000s, and consumers were really becoming more increasingly interested in grass-finished beef. And so, but at that time, there was no nutrient data for grass-finished beef in the USDA nutrient database. And so this was largely due to the variability in the inconsistent production systems for grass-finishing beef due to the limited availability of grass in many regions of the US or year-round. So therefore, I collected grass-finished beef samples to best represent all of the different variabilities from across the US and conducted nutrient analysis on those. And so, of course, we found from that grass-finished beef is just as nutrient rich as our conventional finished beef, and more so was just able to have that established in the nutrient data. So if you go to the nutrient database for standard reference, now you will see that there. So following my completion of my PhD work, I was able to then work with actually the National Cattlemen's Beef Association for about 5 years in the human nutrition research area. Oops, I apologize. And there I got to continue working on some specific research in this area that I will hopefully get to highlight for a second later on. So all of this is kind of history, and really all that matters now is that I'm a wife and a mom of two teenagers, just trying to do my best every day, probably like so many of you are. We are cattle owners still and in the cattle industry. And on what I do on a day-to-day basis is I'm working on building a private practice, a group practice here in Canyon, Texas, in order to provide more access to registered dietitians in the Texas Panhandle. If you're very familiar with this area, we're kind of very spread out and there's not a lot of access. So I really hope to bring more of that to our citizens in this area, while also staying active in research and consulting to educate the consumers on truths of their food. So I don't know about you, but I become frustrated about the noise of the media a lot of times and the misconceptions and the confusions it leaves in the minds of the clients. And I see this daily as new clients sit and tell me about what they eat. And when they get to do certain foods that they talk about, they seem to often feel shy or embarrassed to tell me that they ate beef or hesitant. And I think it's really funny because sometimes they often judge themselves more harshly when they're talking about that they ate beef or meat versus if they were telling me about all the sugar sweetened beverages they ate or different desserts. So I find that very interesting. And it really comes from the varying recommendations that we hear in all of the media, and it becomes really overwhelming for the layperson. So as a nutrition and health professionals, we really have the important role and opportunity in helping redirect these misperceptions and give confidence to our clients about their food. So I hope that's what we can work on today. Of course, we have had the dietary guidelines for Americans for over 4 decades to utilize and help direct us in order to avoid chronic disease. So this is the best set of recommendations based on the science that is available. Of course, the dietary guidelines are critical for establishing standards of all government nutrition programs, such as school lunch programs and what must be served. Additionally, these recommend help in establishing policies. And a key underlying recommendation that has been consistent from the first dietary guidelines is to avoid fat, saturated fat, cholesterol in order to reduce, disease risk, specifically heart disease risk. And this particular recommendation has eluded health professionals to instructing their patients to reduce red meat and other animal products in their diet due to the association with the saturated fat. These guidelines didn't really change all that much over the years in terms of the recommendations. More so, they've really focused on changing how they disseminate those recommendations and the look and the feel of that. We went from the food guide pyramid from when we were, back in the 80s and 90s, and then all the way now to the My Plate diagram. So lots of different ways to disseminate, not a lot of changes in the overall recommendations. However, in the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines, which we're under right now, and that had the theme of make every bite count, this was kind of a historic release because for the first time ever, these guidelines were made also for children under the age of 2. And so in these guidelines, one of the significant recommendations was that infants and toddlers should eat a variety of animal source foods, including meat, poultry, seafood, eggs, and dairy. And so this was super exciting for me to see this finally released to the masses in the dietary guidelines, because I had been familiar with the research that was backing this recommendation for many, many years. And so I too had fed my children beef as their first food. And this is a cute little picture of my son 16 years ago, and with his little beef bib that says, when I get beef, or when I get teeth, feed me beef. And so I always loved that. And I was super excited. And the reason, of course, that we know that that's significant is due to the iron and zinc content that really helps with the growth and development, especially cognitive development. And fortunately, they are still eating beef strong, and now it's just hard to keep enough in the house for this 16-year-old, especially in order to meet everybody's nutrient needs in the household. So with the dietary guidelines for Americans, they are helpful, and they do serve as a foundational recommendation for the population to use. Yet the strongest, longest lasting recommendations to avoid fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol is one that has been magnified and often distorted the image of beef in a healthy diet due to these blanket recommendations many physicians tend to make. The recommendation to avoid fat, saturated fat, it really came from the diet heart hypothesis that was established by research and persistence of Ansel Keys back in the 1960s. These recommendations were derived from epidemiological studies, which do not necessarily determine cause and effect relationships. So that's one thing to note. Meanwhile, over the years, as this became conventional wisdom and the conventional recommendations, other scientists had created research studies and produced data that did contradict the diet heart hypothesis. Yet these studies and scientists were often disregarded, as it is difficult to go against what has become conventional wisdom and still be heard in that. So in the 21st century, several other researchers, young and old, have also come out with data that indicated weak to no evidence of cause and effect of fat or saturated fat in heart disease. Yet many will continue to hold on to these beliefs and disregard new evidence due to their deep inner beliefs. That's just human nature. It's tough to, change something in your mind. But I think this statement kind of sums up and is a good reminder that to advance science, you have to assume what we currently know is either somewhat wrong, totally wrong, or a small piece to a bigger puzzle. So even though it's difficult for humans to maybe disregard the beliefs that they've had so deeply rooted for so many years, often it's even more important to consider new or contradictory evidence so that we can grow and move forward and hopefully have the best recommendations for all. So what we hear today may be opposite of what we hear tomorrow. So I love this old time magazine headlines where we see this shift in what we do here at that time. So the 1980s, of course, eggs and cholesterol were out. And then by the 1990s, the late 1990s, 1999, this is from, they were back on the plate. And then by 2014, discussion of why fat may not be the enemy after all started to come back to the discussion tables. So very interesting to see how all of these things have shifted over the years. And being able to decipher the scientific evidence and be open to new and changing beliefs is tough for those in the science world and puts the average consumer on a fast-paced roller coaster and getting all twisted on what is right and what is wrong. And these types of headlines are impactful. And in today's world of social media influence, there are many extremes and mixed messages being shared, leaving consumers feeling scared and confused on what to eat. Nevertheless, concerns about fat were top of mind since the 1960s, and therefore beef producers led the charge to work to assure their product was meeting the demands of the consumers along with the nutrient guidelines. So let's take a little closer look at the last 60 years of progress in terms of leanness in beef. Take a look at these two steaks and notice the difference. The top steak is from the 1960s and the bottom is from 2013. The two things that changed most that you might be able to notice is in the muscle size first. This steak on the bottom, of course, has more total muscle mass and size. And then the more obvious thing is the difference in the external fat trim along with the intermuscular fat in between the muscles. And so that is where we see the biggest change. So this evolution of lean beef was driven by changes in breeding, feeding, and trimming practices. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So these pictures are perfect highlights that show the advancements made through breeding and feeding. These are the three champion steers from the 1960s, 80s, and this most recent year, 2024. And as you can see, there are many extreme size differences in the ideal cattle over the years. On the left, we have the 1960s steer. His head was only at the man's belt buckle. During this time, English breeds of cattle were the most prevalent. Angus is an English breed, which many of you probably have heard of because of the different branding that goes on in the meat case and with different beef products. So that is an English breed, and they are known to be smaller framed, lighter muscle, and easy finishing. So they put on fat more quickly. And but more importantly, they also produce a more tender and juicy eating experience. So they're well known for that. The middle picture in the 1980s, we see such an opposite extreme. The head of the steer is even with the head of the man next to him. So during the 1970s, what happened is the US began importing continental breeds from Europe. And these breeds are known to be heavy muscled and very lean, producing a higher percentage of lean retail cuts. Unfortunately, these breeds are not as tender and juicy as the English breeds. So now, if we consider the 2024 Grand Champion steer from at the Fort Worth Stock Show, we see a great combination of these two extremes. Through crossbreeding of English and continental breeds, we have gotten to a more moderate size that is more efficient to feed, heavier muscled, and lean, all while being able to produce a consistent eating experience that is tender and juicy. So seems like the best of both worlds. But when changing genetics, it really takes time. And this is partially due to the long gestation cycle of the cattle and that they only produce one offspring at a time. So it can take years to get these desired results. And ultimately, these changes affect the quality and yield grade of the cattle, which determine the value of the cattle at sale. So before moving on, I just wanted to share some basic information on beef grading systems, which are used to establish the value of beef. Essentially, beef with the highest palatability and the highest cutability will be the most valuable. There are two grading systems which go into these value assessments, which is quality grading and yield grading. Quality grading is the predictor of palatability, which is tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. And this is the one that we see labeled in the meat case. USDA Prime, Choice, Select, those are the ones that we see most often. If you're going to a high-end steakhouse, you're probably going to be served a prime steak. If you're shopping in the meat case, you're most often going to see Select or Choice, or maybe both, depending on your market area. But Choice is actually the most prevalent grade in our US cattle. So the factors that go into determining this just are the marbling, which is that intramuscular fat, the flux of fat within the meat that make it tender and juicy. And then also the maturity, which indicates the age of the animals. So we look at the bone and the firmness and the texture and the color of the meat. And then yield grading is based on the amount of fat in proportion to muscling. The most desirable yield grade, of course, is a 1, which means it has the highest percentage of boneless trimmed retail cuts, essentially the leanest you can get. Yield grade 5 is the least desirable, having the greatest amount of all fat. The majority of cattle in the US are grading around a yield grade 3. But in the meat case, you don't really see yield grade differences because, of course, all of our meat in the meat case is pretty much trimmed to the same external fat trimness. So how the industry changed this trimness is kind of the question. And we went from selling primals for instance, which was the whole section of the beef carcass, like the chuck, the loin, the rib, and the round, in where the grocery stores would get in the whole primal into their store, and they would break it down into cuts and then into steaks and roasts as would be. Now, grocery stores most often receive pre-packaged specialized retail cuts with all the fat trimmed off and pre-packaged into portion sizes that we know that consumers would be more easy for the consumers. So Part of this was stimulated from research industry knowing that 81% of Americans prefer to trim visible fat from beef before they eat it anyhow. And so this was one way to definitely increase that efficiency of getting that product to the consumer. Plus, over the years, we have less proficient available workers to be able to cut meat at all of the different grocery stores. So it's more efficient to do it at a single location as well. So the industry conducts numerous audits and surveys in order to understand all of these different things that the consumers want and what would lead to the best cuts to be determined. So again, it's breeding and feeding and finally trimming practices that has enabled beef producers to offer lean cuts that are more convenient to the consumers. So after all of these years of the breeding, the feeding changes, the trimming, the total fat of the beef sirloin steak, for instance, which is a really popular cut, it's great, it's lean, and it's tender and juicy and flavorful. The total fat has decreased by 34% from 1963 to 2010. So that's a very significant reduction of total fat. And then saturated fat was reduced from 17% just in 1990 to 2000. So another significant reduction. So all of these different and evolving practices have definitely improved the leanness of beef. That has allowed beef to meet the needs and the demands of the population. So due to these reductions, the sirloin steak is just one of numerous cuts that meet the dietary guidelines for lean, or the government guidelines for lean. And so actually, it's among 38 cuts of beef that are identified as lean according to government guidelines. Some of these popular cuts include the top sirloin, tenderloin, filet mignon, top loin, strip steak, and the T-bone. So, of course, the tenderloin that's where the filet mignon comes from, and the strip steak comes from the top loin. The government guidelines for lean are listed here. It's less than 10 grams of total fat in a 3-ounce serving, also less than or equal to 4.5 grams of saturated fat, and less than 95 milligrams of cholesterol in that 3-ounce serving. With all of these changes in the beef fat composition, it was necessary to assure accurate data was available for the USDA nutrient database as well. So, as the fat content of beef changed, the industry was committed to supplying the most accurate nutrient data in the database. This timeline highlights the updates and important improvements of beef nutrient data over the past 30 years. It also reflects the time when the greatest changes of beef carcasses has occurred. So it has been a continual job to keep up to date with the nutrient database in order to represent what is actually in the retail case. So going from only 7 cuts that qualified for the government standards for lean in 1990, and then up to 14 cuts in 2002, and then 19 cuts in 2003, and 29 cuts in 2005, there was a lot of work going on behind the scenes. Finally leading to 38 lean cuts in 2011. This work required to add this data to the nutrient database started in 2009, where we got to the 38 cuts with the Nutrient Database Improvement Initiative. And this was a multi-year study that I had the opportunity to be involved with during my time working at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And when you consider all of the various factors in beef animals that may affect nutrient content, such as quality grade, yield grade, region of country, of course, which changes the feedstuffs and the grasses that would be available for feeding, the gender, the breed, all of these vary and must be identified within the study in order to encompass all of these factors and make sure that you have the average nutrient composition that truly represents what is available. So it takes a lot of product, manpower, and funds to produce the most accurate data. And this is critical information, as accurate nutrient data is essential for policy and recommendations and for research such as What We Eat in America survey to accurately represent what people are getting in terms of nutrients. Therefore, it was important to beef producers to assure the work was done to secure the data. Likewise, as consumers' need change, it was important for beef industry to also consider how to make beef cuts more convenient for everyday family meals. And so therefore, butchery practices have also continued to change to fit the needs of consumers by creating new cuts. And in the past, grocers, like I mentioned before, would receive an entire primal, such as the whole chuck or the round, and would break it down into the traditional roast or steaks. Now they receive a specialized cut that fits the average American's busy lifestyle, palates, and budgets. So if we consider the increased efficiencies of cattle productions over the years, we can further see the need for new innovative cuts. This chart shows the U.S. cattle inventory and beef production over the years. And I really love this. This red line shows is the cattle inventory, and the green line is beef production. What this chart shows is that we have significantly reduced the total cattle while pounds of beef produced has actually slightly increased. So essentially, we're producing a more sustainable beef product that is more efficient. We're producing more total pounds of beef with less animals. So this also, though, means that essentially we have produced larger animals, which means that all of the cuts got larger as well, which were maybe not as ideal for those average family meals. These larger cuts and primals increase the need to provide more ideal portion size for the American family. Additionally, research was conducted in which all the muscles in the beef carcass were evaluated individually for tenderness. They found some of the most tender muscles intermingled with less tender muscles within the traditional roast or steaks that existed. And so what they discovered is that simply separating the muscles in a different way would provide a variety of new cuts that were more ideal in portion size, more tender, more affordable for the consumer, and provides even more lean cuts. So I'm going to share a few of my favorite cuts that have evolved over the years, just to show you how this has happened. And so my first one here comes from the top blade steak. Most of you might be familiar with this. As we go further, you might see more, but it comes from the chuck, and which is in the front part of the animal around the shoulder area. So maybe you might be familiar with the 7-bone roast. That is a very traditional old style roast that was always the conventional roast that you could find in the grocery store. So the 7-bone roast contains 7 different muscles actually. And one of it is the infraspinatus, or the top blade, which is this cut here. And so what they found when they did the muscle mapping work is that this muscle is actually the second most tender muscle in the animal next to the tenderloin. And so this is really important to understand because this was in the middle of a cut that you wouldn't normally think of for grilling. It was always braised or, moist heat cooked. So this really changed and opened up the opportunities for this cut in many different ways if we could separate it differently. The only issue with this cut is that there is a connective tissue that runs the length of the cut. And when that is removed, then it's very tender and palatable. However, we do see it still just as top blade steaks, just like this. You can see that there is a connective tissue going through the center of the steak, but yet it's still the same muscle. So it's still tender. You just have to maybe have a little bit more eating around that connective tissue on the eating experience. All of this information can be found at the Beef It's What's for Dinner website. And so it also shows you the different names that it can be sold under. So for instance, boneless top chuck steak, book steak, and butler steak. So keep those in mind because as we move on to the next one, we'll see how these might overlap. So when that heavy connective tissue is removed, we get the flat iron steak from the same top blade. But this steak can also be sold as boneless top chuck steak, book steak, or butler steak. So this is where some confusion can occur, maybe with either the consumer, but also sometimes I have found the food service may get confused as well. So this is a very tender, easy to use steak. It can be grilled, smoked, cooked a variety of different ways. It's going to be wonderful pretty much no matter what you do with it. So this, I wanted to go back through and look at how this was all broken down. So we start with the top blade steak that comes from the chuck, and then we can have either the top blade steaks or the flat iron steaks. So the difference would be that the connective tissue was removed from the flat iron steak and makes it just more palatable and easy to use. So funny story on the flat iron steak and where I think these things can get confused seen is that one time we were eating out and my son had ordered what he thought was a flat iron. And being the meat connoisseur he is, he cut into it and he's like, Mom, this is not a flat iron. This is actually a top blade steak because the connective tissue was in there. So he was a little bit disappointed. Even so, still a good eating experience, but just interesting to learn how these cuts have been fabricated in different ways in order to bring more value to the consumer. So if you visit beefitswhatsfordinner.com, you can find recipes such as this and shows you easy, tasty recipes that feature the flat iron. Actually, you can search on this website by cut for the recipes. So if you have a particular cut stuck in your freezer that you'd like to use, but you don't really know what to do with it, just go to this website and you can type in that cut name and search for recipes specifically that will fit that cut. So, and they'll also show you the best cooking methods and different ways like that. So it's a huge wealth of knowledge. If you've not ever gone there for your beef recipes, please start going there now. You will be amazed at what you can find. So my second favorite value added cut is the shoulder petite tender. And this cut is also lean. It can also be found as or called the butcher's steak, chuck shoulder tender, terrace major. And also in my area, it's actually sold in the grocery store as Western griller steak. So these names may vary, but basically this steak looks like a little tiny tenderloin, and it is also pretty tender, juicy, and it's affordable. And what I love most about this one, it cooks up really nice. You can slice it and it makes wonderful leftovers to throw it on a salad or, maybe even into a stir fry or something the next day. Here's an example of how it could be used in Spanish styled grilled steaks with olives on the beefitswhatsfordinner.com website. So go check that out. And my final cut that I wanted to share with you today is the culotte steak. It is also a lean steak. It's known as well as the top sirloin cap. And I really love this steak. If you guys have ever eaten in a Brazilian restaurant, chances are you've had this cut because this is a Brazilian specialty that just simply with a little bit of salt and pepper has great marbling, tenderness, juiciness. The flavor is amazing. So definitely check it out, and it's affordable. Here's an example of a recipe that you could find on Beef Loving Texans to use that culotte steak with. So there are so many ways to love lean beef, and people love it, and it's good for them. And I know this. And so why would I not want to share this information with them? And that's why it makes it so easy to give them permission to eat beef when I'm working with my clients. Actually, I find that it just opens up their ability to eat healthier overall in general, which is a wonderful opportunity for them in meeting their health goals. So, but why do so many doctors say don't eat beef then? Of course, we talked about this a little bit earlier, maybe with the dietary guidelines, but these blanket recommendations really stems from the fact that red meat is considered to be a source of saturated fat. which has historically been believed to increase the risk for heart disease according to that diet heart hypothesis. So that's where that blanket statement has really come from. Plus, doctors don't just really have the time in a quick office visit to be very clear and give much information to the patients they're working with. And so that's why, as registered dietitians, we really have this opportunity to go deeper with our patients to help them feel more confident about their food. And so the relationship between saturated and fatty acid intake and the risk for heart disease is truly complex. And there is recent evidence that does challenge these earlier conclusions, as I had mentioned earlier. So heart disease has been the #1 killer in the US, and therefore methods for and strategies for reducing the risk of heart disease have been a critical issue and are very top of mind, right? Because we all want to avoid our risk and reduce our risk. The impact of cardiovascular disease is not only has an effect on health, but of course it also has an economic impact. Cardiovascular disease is and has been the leading cause of death since 1921. And it's really sad to think that every 34 seconds an American dies of cardiovascular disease. This map, I think, is interesting. It does show the areas where the highest percentage per capita death rates are for cardiovascular disease, and the darkest colors would indicate the highest percentage areas. And so if you look at the region of the country that's in, actually, my husband pointed this out to me. He's like, that's interesting. That's kind of where the majority, the Southern type of style of food, a lot of deep fat fried food and things like that. And I thought that was interesting. But anyhow, so not only, of course, is this a major health concern in terms of lifespan and overall health, but definitely an economic cost that we have to consider. The 2019 to 2020 data showed that it was 422.3 billion cost due to cardiovascular disease in the US. So, but is fat the culprit, or is red meat the culprit? And so there are several studies that have shown beef is just as effective as other protein sources and heart healthy diets at improving lipid levels. Additionally, studies have found that individuals attempting to follow a predominantly plant-based diet have improved compliance when incorporating lean beef. And so this goes along with what I have found to be true with my own clients. If we allow them to have beef and make them feel confident and okay and teach them how to eat that within the context of a healthy plant-rich diet, then they are going to be much more compliant and much more happy. And their values, all their lab values tend to improve. They begin to drop weight. These are things that I see. So building that confidence in our food and teaching people how to eat it. Furthermore, other investigators have suggested that increased consumption of refined carbohydrates is also associated with cardiovascular risk factors. So I think it's interesting then to consider a little bit about sugar consumption for a moment. Of course, we hear a lot about this anyhow, but the pounds of sugar consumed per person per year has definitely significantly changed, especially since the 1800s, when it was recorded to only be about 6.3 pounds per capita per year. So that is quite a drastic difference from the peak that we hit in the late 1990s, which was up around the 150-pound mark per year. And it's currently we're around the 125-pound mark per year. So that's good that we've made a little bit of improvement there. But looking at the per capita sugar and sweetener consumption, from just the last few decades does show kind of an inverse relationship with fat. And this makes sense because we were in the low fat craze, as we kind of call it, where products were being produced to meet the demands of low fat diet needs. And as we know in foods, fat, sugar, and salt make food taste better. And so when you're preparing or making food, especially packaged food, you need to, if you're taking out one thing, you need to add in another thing. And we do know that that definitely increased the total sugar that was available then, easily and readily available to the consumers. So this could be a factor in the continuous increase of obesity over the years. Of course, that is just something to keep in mind. Is fat really the only culprit? Likewise, it could also affect the nutrient availability in the diet. So it's important to consider fat and the function of fat in the diet and how important it is. We can't overlook the importance. I always think back because I grew up in a low fat craze. And so I humbly think of this story when I was early in my PhD and just starting all of the nutrition, human nutrition work and classes. And it got to thinking one day, I got to thinking, oh my goodness, I have no fat in my lunchbox because I always packed my lunch. I was always on the go and had to have food with me. And at that time, if you had a granola bar, it was low fat, no fat, of course. If I had a yogurt, it was no fat. And then I might have fruit and vegetables in there. And on a good day, I probably had a sandwich that had some meat and cheese on it. So that would have helped. But I got thinking about it and I thought, oh my goodness, I am really missing the opportunity to actually be utilizing my fat soluble vitamins in my diet because I didn't always have fat. I often point this out to certain clients as well. I've had those tell me before they eat a green leafy salad and there was no source of fat on it and maybe no source of other fat in their meal at the same time. And so, of course, vitamin K, being a fat soluble vitamin, is really critical to actually utilize if we're going to have that nice leafy green salad. So we want to have a little fat with that in order to make sure that we're using it. Of course, fats also provide the palatability to the food and are a concentrated energy source as well. Um, any foods that contain fats will have a combination of saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat. The degree or proportion of the fat will vary depending on the food, and the foods are typically then categorized according to the type of fat it has as a larger percentage of that total fat composition. So just a brief review, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the different fat categories and foods that are typically categorized in these. But monounsaturated fats, of course, we have a lot of our nuts and avocado and olives, and our polyunsaturated fats. We really have some really good ones, such as the omega-3 fatty acids that we like to see in fatty fish and things like flax. And then our saturated fat food sources, typically we consider are coming from the animal source foods, but also we don't forget that there are plants as well, such as palm and coconut, that are very high in saturated fats as well. So despite beef being categorized as a saturated fat source, according to What We Eat in America survey, it has been found that beef is a primary source for monounsaturated fats in the diet as well. So this graphic further exemplifies how foods contain a combination of all fatty acids. On the right, you see olive oil, which has the most total fat as it is a fat. Additionally, as you would suspect, a large proportion of this fat is monounsaturated fat, which is indicated by the darkest color on that graph bar. On the left side, we have all the way to the left, we have beef top round steak, and then come in one, it's beef tenderloin steak, and then followed by chicken breast, and then chicken thighs, and then tuna, and then salmon. And so what we see from a total fat perspective is lean beef is very comparable to these other meat sources in terms of total fat. Additionally, fatty acid makeup seems to stand up to the test as well. And so we're going to look at that a little closer. Beef's heart healthy fat profile is something I really like to share with people because this is kind of a misunderstood fact. Of course, half of beef's fatty acids are monounsaturated fatty acids, which are those same ones that are found in the olive oil and are considered heart healthy. Yes, beef does have a larger percentage of fatty acids coming from saturated fat. However, it's important to understand a third of beef saturated fatty acids is actually in the form of stearic acid. And we know that stearic acid is neutral in its effect on blood cholesterol. Or if you ever hear them promoting the fat that is available in chocolate, of course, that's stearic acid as well. So when you put that all into context, then it makes sense why we have so many studies that do show that beef is just as effective in a heart-healthy diet as other protein sources. So I want to go through some of those key studies that we do have. First is the BOLD study, which was the biggest feeding study that first compared beef to other proteins normally consumed. And this was in the confines of a DASH diet, the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. And BOLD stands for beef in an optimal lean diet. So the objective was to evaluate heart-healthy diets with lean beef as a main protein source in lowering cardiovascular risk in individuals with moderate hypercholesterolemia. And then they compared these to diets that were healthy American DASH diets, or the healthy American diet and a DASH diet. And then they also had a BOLD Plus diet, which was additional beef. And so essentially, participants in this BOLD study ate lean beef every day and were able to lower their cholesterol. There were several key findings from this study. Participants who ate lean beef every day, in many cases twice a day, and still lowered cholesterol. And then cholesterol levels were also lowered just as effectively on the beef-containing diets as with the DASH diet, which limited beef intake. And then finally, researchers also noted that the BOLD and the BOLD Plus diet, so the one with extra beef servings, actually improved apolipoproteins, which are an emerging risk factor for heart disease as well. Here is a similar example of beef in a Mediterranean dietary pattern. And so there's a few different representations here, but on the left, the Mediterranean patterns that we have is compared to a typical US intake. So the med red is 500 grams was intake of beef, and then the control was 200 grams. And basically the results showed that the total cholesterol decreased and greater reduction in the med red, which was the one with the more beef intake than the med control. So that was a positive result. And then over on the right, we have different varying amounts of beef that were added to a Mediterranean style diet, as low as 0.5 ounces of lean beef per day up to 5.5 ounces of lean beef per day. And then these were compared to the average American diet and based on calculated energy requirements. Oops. All med diets here decreased LDL cholesterol compared to the average American diet. So again, very favorable, and shows how beef can be just as effective in a heart-healthy diet. The objectives of this study, this is on the State of Slim and the Beef Wives study. The objective was to determine the impact of consuming lean beef as part of a high-protein diet on weight-reducing diets and body composition and cardiometabolic health. So there were two test diets. There was the high-protein one with beef, and that was greater than 4 servings of beef per week. And then there was the high-protein diet that was no beef. It was beef restricted and had other sources of protein. And the results show that the high-protein diets, either if they were rich or restricted in red meat intakes, are effective for decreasing body weight, especially body fat, and improving cardiometabolic health factors. So all of these are very compelling newer studies just in the past 10 or so years that we have that show that beef can be just as effective in a heart-healthy diet. And of course, we don't want to forget that beef is truly a complete and efficient package. You know, in a 3-ounce serving of lean beef, you can get 25 grams of protein. You have 9 other essential vitamins and minerals besides the protein at a good or excellent level. And when you consider that we're dealing with mostly issues where we need to control weight and get our body weights to a healthy weight that we can have less chronic disease risk, we need to consider having this most nutrient-rich package like beef in the diet, where we can get a whole lot of bang for our caloric dollars. So this is something to consider. So I hope that this information has been eye-opening to you and helps you understand how the beef industry has continued to work tirelessly over the years to always meet the needs of the consumers and uphold the highest nutritional value that can be. We are and do have a healthy fatty acid profile, and lean beef is a perfect source of protein and a heart-healthy diet. So I hope that this will all give you the confidence not only to maybe incorporate that lean beef into your diet, but also giving the permission to your clients as you go forward in your work. Here is some links for the resources that we shared some information from in this slide. Like I said, that Beef, It's What's for Dinner is a great reference place to go for everything from recipes to understanding everything about your cuts. So thank you very much. And I'm open to answering any questions you might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Leheska. Such great information. And I think you just really summarized it so well there with all of the science behind, just giving patients, clients, and ourselves that permission to make food choices that we enjoy, that nourish us, and just having that science behind all of those different things is so meaningful. I loved how you opened it up also just with like some of your own personal experiences in practice, because I think we all have seen that at different times, whether it's even in a practice setting or even with our own family members and friends and so forth. We don't have any questions just as of yet, so I'd love if anyone wants to drop a question. Oh, here, actually, there's one. So this person, maybe you see it too, where does Wagyu beef fit into this picture? So that's a great question for sure.
That is a great question, because that is one thing I didn't, of course, touch on that particular breed, but more importantly, the intramuscular fat or the marbling in cattle. Wagyu beef, of course, is a particular breed of beef that is produces a high fat content, a higher fat content. Of course, it's a wonderful eating experience, very tender, juicy and flavorful. But an important thing to understand is that the fatty acid composition in that beef primarily is coming from the marbling. And that's where the additional fat deposits actually are. And what we know about marbling or intramuscular fat is that it is extremely high in monounsaturated fatty acids. So compared to that already heart healthy profile that I showed you of the average fat profile of beef, the intramuscular fat, the marbling in beef, any kind of beef, is actually even higher in monounsaturated fatty acids. So it's a very heart healthy fat.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great one. I feel like I hear that question come up in a lot of different circumstances with, healthcare professionals, with consumers and so forth. So thank you for addressing that one. We have one person that's just, commenting on, the price of beef at this time, and honestly, all animal protein are all foods that we enjoy. And I think from our perspective, that's why, Jennifer showcased a couple different great lean, affordable cuts that would fit within the context of a healthful diet. Some of the resources I'll share back in our post-webinar survey will, again, showcase those affordable cuts. I think we also have to remember the portion size that we're talking about. It's a 3-ounce portion. So when we're educating folks on that, and it's not an 8-ounce piece of animal protein and so forth, that is a great education opportunity that will also help with the budget concern as well. And then we have another person that's asking, how do you address portion control with clients who are used to eating out in large portions of cuts? So similar to what I did there, kind of dove into without knowing, specific to marbling. So maybe they're choosing more of that protein that's higher in marbling and not so many vegetables and grains on their plate.
And was that in regard to eating out? Is that what you said?
I think specifically, yeah, how to address portion control with clients who are used to eating out in the large portion. So again, where you're getting that 8-ounce steak potentially in a steakhouse, and then you're preparing a different portion at home. So yeah, maybe any insight on that would be helpful.
Yeah, well, there's a whole lot of things. Of course, as many people probably do, the first thing in terms of portion control when you're eating out, normally portions of everything you get is too much. And so a lot of times you might just want to automatically set aside or get a to-go box to put that, or share half of that with somebody else. Of course, from my experience eating out, where we're really overserved is in our sides, especially those really starchy and less expensive foods, where we can really fill up. And funny enough, from some research that I heard in a presentation several years back at FNCE, um, where it talked about blood glucose control in terms of the order that you ate your food. If the starch was eaten first versus the protein or the vegetables eaten first in terms of the blood glucose control. And they showed that they had seen significant differences in terms of that, meaning that if you ate the bread that came out first, and then the meat and vegetables later, that they had a higher spike in blood glucose versus if the protein and the vegetables were eaten first, and then the bread later, then they had a lower. So I thought this was really compelling. And from a scientific standpoint, it made complete sense because you have that protein or the vegetables already being broken down. It's going to slower that blood glucose spike. So it's things like that might sound a little
Mm-hmm.
complex, but I really like to bring out with my clients because then that also kind of resonates with them too, because when we do go out to eat, for instance, we're automatically served so many things that we might aimlessly or mindlessly eat without thinking, just because it's like, oh, this is how we do it. The other thing
Mm-hmm.
is, when we talk about fattest versus, leanest cuts, ribeye steak is one of those steaks that I like to call a celebratory steak. So it's something we celebrate with. It is one that has a higher marbling content, but then also because the two muscles, we have more seam fat as well. So it doesn't fit into the lean beef statement, but it's wonderful. And so, for special occasions, I say, we save those for more special occasions. That's what makes them special. And
Mm-hmm.
going from there. So I hope
I
that.
love that. It comes back to that like permission to again enjoy the foods that you really love and for whatever the occasion, when it's a special occasion, everyday meals and so forth. So that was a great point there. And sadly we're already at 2:02 Eastern time, so we've got to wrap this webinar up, but we just want to thank the attendees for joining today's webinar. That we hope you'll take a few minutes to complete the post-webinar survey that can be accessed via a QR code that will pop up on the screen, or a link in the chat. You'll also receive that link via email. As an added bonus, we'll love to, award 3 randomly selected winners with some beef swag packs that are valued at $25 if you complete the survey by midnight Eastern on Friday, May 24th. So a little added bonus to hopefully get some great survey results on that. We usually do get a really great survey completion rate, so please help us out with that. And then again, we just want to thank you so much to our wonderful presenter, Dr. Leheska. This was just such a different perspective, and I think a different type of topic for a healthcare professional audience. And I think it really just covered so many wonderful bases and provided so many great tools and resources for those working in various practice settings today. So thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that our audience here will see us again on August 14th for the next webinar, where we'll send that link out in our post-webinar survey to register for. So thank you all and have a great rest of the day.